very important because it allows people to make a report confidentially without becoming a further target of abuse or a new target of abuse. The self-policing inherent in the app's design is a very innovative way to make use of forms of what has been called peer-to-peer surveillance. Many media scholars of the internet are now talking about peer-to-peer surveillance as a feature of contemporary digital culture. This is where we are all watching each other, monitoring each other online through the ways that we are on Facebook and Lines, very popular in Japan, is that right? And is that how you pronounce it? Lines?
Yeah.
Lines? And Snapchat, Instagram, we are all watching each other. It's a form of peer-to-peer surveillance. And in our interviews with staff of the Kick It Out organisation, we also found an interpretation of racism as a universal form of prejudice that's located in everyday acts by individuals, mainly verbal racist abuse that happens in public settings. So this was the main aim of the app, was to combat verbal abuse in public settings, particularly within the football stadium, going to and from a football match. For Appli CCIF, this was an app developed by the French organisation Collective Against Islamophobia in France, and also another app in Australia, Islamophobia Watch Australia. The interpretation of racism was different again. It wasn't a kind of an idea about a universal form of racism. It was more tightly linked to ideas of systemic injustice rooted in histories of colonial domination and the need to counter racism that is targeted at particular racialised communities. So in this case, Muslims. Muslim Australians, in the case of Islamophobia Watch Australia, and French Muslims in the case of Appli CCIF. As in the case of Kick It Out, the everyday presence of the mobile is key to the ability of the app to provide an individual response to racism. However, in these apps, there's a very different way in which the user is positioned, and it is much more aimed at directly at individuals on the receiving end of abuse rather than bystanders. Okay, so even though it's a reporting app, the audience is different. It's mainly aimed at victims of racist incidents. Though there is an increasing number of bystanders who are using these apps as they become better known. So even though it started off as a way for people who are being the victim of abuse to make a report, it's now being used much more by witnesses of incidents. One of the representatives from Islamophobia Watch Australia spoke to me of the main motivation, the catalyst for the app, as the abuse that is targeted at hijab-wearing Muslim women on public transport, particularly after the 2014 Sydney raids. This is a highly mediatised series of raids of homes. It was reported in all of the papers in Australia, of the homes of suspected Muslim extremists, although nobody in those raids was ever criminally charged. They were held for quite a long period of time, but none of them were charged. There have been many more raids subsequently. So the rationale for a reporting app like Islamophobia Watch Australia proves to be very well founded. Since 2001 in Australia, there's been increasing levels of racism experienced by Arab and Muslim Australians in public settings. A report commissioned by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission in 2004 found that the street was the most cited physical site of racism, abuse or violence, with 58% of people who were surveyed having experienced racism on the street. So This is borne out to be similar in recent surveys. So in 2015-16, the Challenging Racism Project found that almost 40% of racist incidents are experienced on public transport. So even though we have a growing amount of hate speech online, and Timur and I have talked a lot about kind of cyber racism, it's an emerging site of racism. There are still other settings of where racism occurs, and public transport in Australia is one of those key sites. So the app Islamophobia Watch Australia was launched just at the time that I carried out the interview with the staff member of IWA. And its design was based on the model of the app by the French organisation CCIF. That's why I put them side by side like that, because the Australian app was modelled on the French app, CCIF.
Can I ask a quick
Yes,
question
please
about
do.
when you say report, like what does that involve?
Yes. So that I'll talk a little bit about it now. Actually, I'm just about to go into how it works. But let me know if I don't cover all of your questions. So in both cases, the reporting apps are part of a larger media kit for reporting, and both organisations also host a web and Facebook page where reports can be recorded. So individuals can report on the app, but they can also report on the website or on Facebook. Both of these systems, these apps, have a very large back-end system for processing reports. And these are largely invisible to the app users, but they're a crucial part of the reporting apparatus. So Islamophobia Watch Australia relies on a group of volunteers, many of them are law students, to process the reports. So once a report has been filled in on the app, it uses fields where you can text fields. You can enter the location of the app, although that can be automatically detected as well. It's one of the advantages of the mobile phone, is that it can geolocate where you are. A description of the incident, your name if you want to provide it, and contact number so that it can be tied to back to a person who filled in the report. So there's a back-end system for processing those reports. In the case of IWA, they are students, and also for Islamophobia, Register, which is another similar web-based only site where you can fill in reports, submit reports. And those lawyers are very important, or law students are very important, because they make decisions and they give advice to those people who have submitted the reports on whether to lay whether they can lay criminal charges, so whether to refer that report to the police, or whether to make a complaint, whether the incident should be referred to the Australian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, called the HREOC, under the Racial Discrimination Act, which was first established in 1975. There are a number of clauses or legal statutes that allow individuals to make a complaint to the Commission based on racial discrimination, covering areas such as employment, housing, advertising, access to public places, the provision of goods and services, and also hate speech or racial vilification, which is a relatively new clause in the Racial Discrimination Act, 18C and 18D. So the difference between IWA and aptly CCIF when it comes to making reports is that the French organisation has a team of lawyers whose role it is to also advise people on whether and how they should make a complaint. But in France, the onus is on individuals to take legal action in relation to an act of racial discrimination, and organisations are unable to act on an individual's behalf. And so that's one of the main differences between France and Australia.
So France is which and Australia is?
As in Australia, an organisation can make a complaint on an individual's behalf. In France, they can't. The individual has to make the complaint. And then often the individuals don't know how to frame it in legal terms. So many of the complaints made in France don't go anywhere. It's just a dead end. So one of the things that we also found interesting is that a lot of these reporting apps have the added function of visualizing the experience or the existence of racism through live maps and news feeds. So, for example, the live mapping feature in the Islamophobia Watch Australia app is a way to use the reports of racist attacks to represent racism in Australia, to map it geographically on a map of Australia and show the extent of the problem. Now you can see here that it looks like there's no racism in Australia. There's like 2 or 3 incidents, but this is just because I captured that screenshot just after the app was launched. More recently, the Islamophobia Register has published a report on 256 incidents that have been reported in the last year. So that gives you an idea of about how many reports might be made in a 12-month period, about 250 or so reports. So this news feed is a very interesting feature we found, and Alana and I were interested in it because in Australia and also in France, we felt that the news feed operates in a way to demonstrate the existence of Islamophobia, particularly where there is a history and a climate of denial that actually exists, or that it's even recognised as racism. So many people in Australia would argue that Islamophobia is not racism because it's based on a religious group or a faith. And it's a very important record and archive as well of media reports and video recordings of racist incidents. And the news feed is interesting in another respect as well, because there's no pretense or goal to achieve balanced reporting of issues like there might be in the mainstream newspaper or television, where there's this, at least a pretense of trying to be objective. So these news feeds perform as a corrective of racialised framing of news stories in the mainstream media. And this is not a trivial site of racism. So the Heriock study, which I referred to before, found that the media is the second most frequently cited place of racism and abuse of Arab and Muslim Australians after the street. In France, the Appli CCIF news feed was seen as core to the anti-racism strategy of the organisation and the most used section of the app, even more than the reporting. The feed was inspired by the New Republic news app, and they saw the app as part of a promotion of bottom-up citizen reporting, or bottom-up journalism. Have you heard of that term? Sort of citizen journalism, drawing on citizen-generated media reports. And it's one of the main sources contributing to a European database on Islamophobia in 8 countries called ImamNet, IMAMNet, ImamNet. So we can see that the Islamophobia Watch and CCIF apps might be read as a response to the feeling that individuals are powerless in the face of popular state-sanctioned Islamophobia. They're part of an overall strategy to bring to light and respond to racist attacks within a perceived climate of acceptability of racist attitudes and policies. and also to challenge the racialized framing in the media. So this final app is a very different one again, and it's the only one of the apps that we studied that is not a reporting app. In fact, it's a game. Everyday Racism is an app based on a role-playing format. So role-playing is at the heart of the philosophy to enable people, bystanders mainly, to experience something that others experience regularly. The app aims to increase users' understanding of racism by walking in someone's shoes and empowers people to take action on someone else's behalf. So how it works is that a user selects one of 3 characters to be for 7 days while playing the game. You can be an Aboriginal man, a Muslim woman, or an Indian exchange student. And there's also a final option of playing yourself. So the game is very innovative in its use of a game format to create empathy, the idea that that you can understand someone else's experience of racism. But it's also been quite critiqued in some quarters for reinforcing white privilege. It's something which will be interesting to see how they deal with that in future versions of the game. Some scholars have argued that by making the avatar yourself genderless and lacking a racial identity, the player is unproblematically framed as white, since this becomes the unmarked norm. So this is seen as potentially a problem with this app, even though in other respects it has been a very successful app and it's been used by many people. So they argue that the result might be that racism is unwittingly perpetuated through the benefits of racial privilege, such as being able to exit the experience whenever you wish. This resonates with Lisa Nakamura's critique. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Lisa Nakamura, very famous Japanese-American media scholar who did groundbreaking work on racism on the internet very early on, from 1995 all the way up to today. She critiqued the early cyberspace gamers, or mudders, who performed what she called as identity tourism. This is where online avatars are altered to take on the stereotyped traits of another race. And she was very critical of the way in which in the early days of the internet, many players would take on the persona of being a Japanese samurai, and that in fact it was always white male Americans who were doing this. So she was saying this is a privilege of white American men to be able to act out another ethnicity. So this is something that you could argue is a problem in this game. Similarly, that it's a type of identity tourism. But I think the game also goes beyond identity tourism. It might have some of the problems that come with trying to experience racism through the embodiment of another race. But at the same time, this is something that I think that the game developers are trying to work with in the next version, because ultimately the aim is very different. Their goal is to try and create empathy among people and bystanders. So we came out with 3 main key questions that we would like to explore in further studies. Key issues that I think these apps really highlight. First of all, what does it mean to think about responding to a racist incident using a phone that we experience as an extension of ourselves when you are racialised? My colleague Alana has taken up this issue in more depth. But one of the things that we think is really at stake here is that when you are recording and geolocating racism, this is simultaneously both embodied and disembodied. As in the case of the Everyday Racism app, the presentation of the raced body functions as the site of the experience of the problem of race. So what does that mean? Are you actually reinforcing race as a problem if you are using the site of the experience of racism with your phone as the point of articulating that moment or reporting that moment of racism? Another key question that we're interested in researching further is how to go beyond individualized responses to acts of racism. So we observed a tendency across all of the apps to reinforce the individual aspects of racism over the structural dimensions, particularly in the way that the apps individualize responsibility for responding to racism, and the focus is on individual behaviour change through self or peer policing. Another area that I'm very interested in exploring further is understanding the limits of reporting-based apps, or reporting websites for that matter, where these rely heavily on legal protections and enforcement agencies for processing and taking action on reported incidents. These authorities decide whether to pursue and thus validate experiences of everyday racism. And so for reporting to be effective, there needs to be a high level of trust in official institutions for obtaining justice. Since carrying out this study, Alana and I have become aware of a number of other initiatives to track police